We're talking today about respiration. And now, previously, we've discussed respiration in terms of aerobic and anaerobic, and in terms of what goes on in the mitochondria of the cells when those cells use the raw materials to produce energy. But in this sense, we're talking about respiration as in basically breathing, the movement of air in and out of our lungs, and what happens to the gases that are entering or leaving the body. So respiration in these terms is about breathing rather than what's going on in the individual cells themselves. So the overall term we can use to describe that is gaseous exchange. Gaseous exchange will always occur when there is a difference of difference in concentration across a permeable membrane. So forgetting that we're talking about lungs or breathing or whatever at the moment, let's just think about this diagram we have here. So we've got a membrane that's providing a barrier between two chambers. And in one chamber, you can see we've got a lot of blue gas and not very much yellow. And on the other side of that permeable membrane, we've got a lot of yellow gas and not a lot of blue. And this is not a comfortable situation. Gases like to be in a status of equilibrium, so where you've got equal gases on one side and the other side of the membrane. The membrane is permeable, and therefore the gases can diffuse from the area of high concentration to the area of low concentration, and you will end up with a more equal balance. So we can see here we've got the permeable membrane, so the blue gases are travelling towards the yellow side because there's more of them on one side of the other. And the yellow gases will travel towards the blue side, again to create some kind of equilibrium. But it tends to go beyond the point of equilibrium, almost overcompensating. So what we're left with is still that same semi-permeable membrane, but where there was once lots of blue, there's now lots of yellow, and where there was once lots of yellow, there's now lots of blue. So gaseous exchange has occurred across this permeable membrane. And this is exactly what goes on in terms of respiration within our body, gaseous exchanged from the external to the internal parts of the body. So now we need to split this into two terms. We're going to think of internal respiration and external respiration. Thinking of external first. External respiration occurs to the influx of gases into the body in its initial phase and the release of waste gases. So that initially occurs between the lungs and the blood vessels. The air enters our lungs and it sits in the air sacs in the alveoli, and it needs to somehow get from there to the bloodstream. And we've also got the waste gases in the bloodstream that need to get out and be into our lungs so that we can exhale them. So that is external respiration, gaseous exchange between the lungs and the bloodstream. And this occurs in the alveoli, which is a term you should already be quite familiar with from the reading that you've done so far on this topic. So we have our alveolar ducts, which lead to the alveoli, the little blind-ended sacs, like a sack of, like a bunch of grapes, where the air collects. And each of these alveolar sacs is surrounded by the pulmonary artery and the pulmonary vein, and between them, the capillaries. And the capillaries are bound with the alveolar wall to create the respiratory membrane. And if we go back to look at the diagram here, this is our respiratory membrane, this red line. It is one cell thick, simple squamous epithelium. So there's not the wall of the alveolar sac and then the capillary, they're combined. So you've just got this one cell thick between the alveolar, the sac, the air contained within there, and the bloodstream. So diffusion across that single cell membrane is pretty easy, just like what we've looked at here. So that's exactly what we've got. If we think of the top of this slide as the air inside the alveoli sacs, then we have the respiratory membrane separating from the blood inside the capillaries. So at this point, this blood has come from the heart. It's deoxygenated blood in the pulmonary arteries. So the blood in here, in the capillaries, in the bottom half, has very little oxygen left, so very little blue, but lots of waste gases. And in these terms, we're going to think mostly about carbon dioxide, but there are other waste gases. So lots of yellow, lots of carbon dioxide, very little oxygen. However, inside the alveoli sacs, that's air that we've inhaled, so that's got lots of oxygen, but not many other waste gases. And this is not a situation that is comfortable for the body because it likes this equilibrium between gases. So, across this very thin single cell respiratory membrane, the oxygen will quite happily diffuse towards the capillary blood, and the waste gases or the carbon dioxide will diffuse towards the alveoli sacs. And remember how I said it will always overcompensate slightly. So by the time that has occurred, we'll have very little oxygen left in the alveoli sacs, but lots of oxygen in the capillaries, and very little carbon dioxide in the capillaries, but lots in the alveoli sacs. And that is external respiration, the movement of oxygen from the lungs to the bloodstream. Thinking then about internal respiration, this is where the oxygen that's now got into the bloodstream via external respiration then has to diffuse out into the tissues. There's no point in it just staying in the bloodstream. It can't do anything. The oxygen is bound with the hemoglobin in the red blood cells, but it needs to be able to get back out and into the tissues, which then need to use that oxygen as their raw material to produce energy. So it's exactly the same in that we have one substance that's full of oxygen and one substance that's got very little. So this time it's the capillaries, the blood in the capillaries that's got lots of oxygen and little waste, whereas the tissues have used all the oxygen to do whatever it is that they're doing, and they've created quite a lot of waste gases. So they have a high carbon dioxide concentration and a low oxygen concentration. Therefore, the same process will occur. The capillary epithelium is one cell thick, simple squamous epithelium. So passage across that is quite easy for gases. The oxygen will move from the blood in the capillaries to the tissues, and the carbon dioxide will move from the tissues into the capillaries. And therefore, we're left with a situation where we have oxygen-rich tissues in order to perform their functions, and carbon dioxide-rich blood, which will return to the heart via the veins and then to the lungs via the pulmonary artery in order to be expired. That is internal respiration. So external, between the lungs and the blood, internal, between the blood and the tissues. And it's very important you understand the difference between those two processes. As with all things, there are occasions when it goes a bit wrong, and it's just a couple of things I wanted to mention where respiration hasn't gone quite to plan. One of them is hyperventilation, which is what this image is depicting here. You're probably aware of that if people are hyperventilating, so they're breathing too quickly, too rapidly, we get them to breathe into a paper bag or a rebreather. So the problem with hyperventilation is you're exhaling so much that you're actually getting rid of too much carbon dioxide. And that might sound a bit strange because we think carbon dioxide is a waste product, but actually we do need a certain element of carbon dioxide in order for our nervous system to function normally. So if we're breathing too rapidly, you end up with too much oxygen and not enough carbon dioxide, because the external respiration process is going on too quickly. And that can lead to dizziness, sort of blurred or blackout vision, and eventually actually hyperventilation will lead to loss of consciousness. So it's really, really easy to treat. And that's why we breathe into a paper bag, because we're expelling too much carbon dioxide. So if you can just get the patient to rebreathe what they have expelled, they will just breathe back in that carbon dioxide, and therefore this cycle of taking in too much oxygen, not enough carbon dioxide will be broken. You also obviously need to encourage your patients to slow down their breathing. Generally, the reason why people are hyperventilating in a situation that we would come across is because of fear, maybe a panic attack, something like that. So you need to put into place some relaxation, calming breathing techniques. But breathing into the paper bag will help bring their carbon dioxide levels back up. So excessive breathing isn't good for us. The other thing that can happen is carbon monoxide poisoning, and we talked about this a little already when we've talked about red blood cells and hemoglobin, and how hemoglobin should have, in an ideal situation, each hemoglobin molecule should carry 4 oxygen molecules to create oxyhemoglobin. However, in the presence of carbon monoxide, the hemoglobin will preferentially carry that rather than the oxygen. So at the external respiration process, the oxygen won't pass into the capillaries. Instead, the carbon monoxide will, and we will just exhale the oxygen again. We can't use carbon monoxide to carry out our bodily functions like we do oxygen. So you've got all these hemoglobin molecules which are full of carbon monoxide. So therefore, the internal respiration process doesn't occur because there isn't any oxygen in the capillaries to move towards the tissues. And therefore the body can't function because you can't then go about your anaerobic or aerobic respiration as you normally would. So carbon monoxide poisoning is fatal. It used to be a real problem with old-fashioned gas canister heaters. It's an odorless gas. It's an invisible gas. So people were breathing it in and not knowing, and actually, particularly in their sleep, and dying in their sleep because you essentially just go to sleep and don't wake up. So that's why we have carbon monoxide detectors in our houses now, and also any appliance that's using gas, natural gas, to produce whatever it produces. So like heaters, for example, they have to be regularly maintained to prevent the leakage of carbon monoxide. And the detectors that are there will go off before we get to the point where we're becoming damaged by it. So internal and external respiration is what keeps us alive. Breathing is what keeps us alive. But if we're breathing in the wrong thing, or if we're breathing too much, then that can cause problems as well. So that's us covered the topic of gaseous exchange. This combined with the other sections that you've looked at in terms of the structure and function of the respiratory system should be able to now meet the learning outcomes that we have set for this section.